In my last video, I explained how it's possible to reach the 250% ER threshold with any weapon. If you want to understand how Brant's ER scaling works, I do suggest checking out that video first. But today, I want to talk about which build is actually best, and what if I told you that the best in-slot echo set for Brant depends on the weapon you use. For all people who are already farming echoes for Brant, myself included, I want to go over the best build configurations. Here is the general weapon comparison. I'm blurring out the signature because the final release version hasn't been announced yet. It's definitely still the runaway best option, but I can't give any exact numbers as of yet. Depending on who you're following, a lot of you might be wondering what is going on with this Emerald of Genesis portion, especially right here with the jump between R3 and R4. That's because while R4 and R5 are calculated on tide breaking, R3 and below are actually using Molten Rift. If you're familiar with Emerald, you know that ER is in its passive and it increases with rank, and at R4, the ER passive is high enough to unlock tide breaking. Now, this might be all the info some people were looking for, but feel free to stick around for the actual analysis. On stream, I played the trial version of Brant in the version 2.1 event to come up with a rotation I could use for damage testing. Basically, it looks like this, and it will trigger the passives in other swords and Molten's 5-piece passive, so that I could make a fair comparison, while also showcasing some of his larger sources of damage. And I used this rotation to compare weapons and, more importantly, echoes. So first, let me talk a bit about Overture so I can explain the methodology a bit. Normal echoes here mean all 5 echoes are double crit with kinda low rolls of 7.5 crit rate and 15% crit damage. Obviously not easy, but can be attainable with echo grinding. For ER, the substat is either 10 or what is needed to reach the threshold. If the echo substats require 5 high ER substats, I take it out of the list, because although it is attainable, it's not realistic. So here, the echo burden is talking about the ER substat burden. Max echoes is with max rolls for crit rate and ER substats. You can ignore this, but it's mostly just to show the damage potential for those who are curious. The best in slot configuration is 5-piece tide breaking with ER/ER3 cost. Although you can get higher damage on ER fusion, the echo burden requires 5 high rolls on ER substats, so due to the lack of attainability, it is removed from the lineup, despite having more damage potential. Especially when you take into account, it is very easy to reach the threshold on ER/ER. It makes the choice pretty easy. The 4 cost should be crit rate, and the 4 cost for tide breaking is the dragon, which will buff fusion and basic attack damage. Now, I am still seeing people say they're just going to use Moonlit, but please do not do this. In my last video, I explained his personal damage on a damage echo set will outweigh the damage gained from the Moonlit buff on the next resonator. And here you can see the massive loss of damage by putting him on Moonlit. Finally, due to the ER availability of Overture, tide breaking is outpacing the Molten set as well. Now, some people might be wondering if there is still an ER echo burden on Molten, so let me explain it real quick. Brant's liberation cost is 175. Now, compared to Gian or Carlotta, who have 125 resonance cost, 175 is really high. I don't know exactly, but his ER need for getting his liberation could be anywhere from 170 to like 250 ER. The rotation I'm using right now is really short, so if I'm planning on using this rotation, he would need a lot of ER. So to stay safe, I would like to see around 200 to 230 ER on Molten configs. Okay, let's take a look at Emerald. For R1, you literally cannot reach the 250 threshold on tide breaking 43311, but you can on the cope build of 33311. However, this is indeed just cope because you lose crit value and the buffs from the 4 cost echo, so Molten is better. Brant converts ER to attack, so an ER3 cost is like you're using an attack main stat. Actually, because of Brant's ER conversion rate, ER ends up being better than attack percent, around 195% ER and higher, so ER to attack scaling is higher than just building on raw attack. Additionally, you get more ER from stats anyway than if they were attack. So now, if you move to ER fusion, it makes it harder to build ER, and this translates to actually lower damage. If you're using Molten, the normal Inferno Rider buffs fusion and basic attack damage. For Brant, 70 to 80% of his damage is basic attack damage, depending on your rotation. So the normal Inferno Rider is better than the Nightmare one. You do have to transform and hit with the normal Inferno Rider to get the buff, but it's not that bad. There is one thing you have to be aware of though, and that is that the Infernal Rider is a ground echo, meaning you have to be on or near the ground to deploy, but Brant will intro into the air. Luckily, this is really easy to manage because you can still use the skill to plunge to the ground, which also triggers the Molten 5-piece passive. So you intro, skill, plunge, then use the Infernal Rider tap 3 hit, and from there you can skill jump or liberation or just keep going. If you're doing quick swap, you can also deploy the echo during quick swaps. Although the Nightmare Echo is easier to use, I think the normal one is pretty easy to use too, so at least it's still convenient. Since Emerald is a crit rate weapon, you can go for crit damage 4 cost normal Infernal Rider. From R2, you can actually reach the 250 threshold for tide breaking, but the echo burden is too high, so I took it out of the running. For 250 ER to be realistically attainable on 43311, you need at least R4. Nonetheless, you can see at R2 and R3, tide breaking has more damage potential, but it's just too hard to get to that 250 threshold. Finally, for R4 and R5, you can use for 3311 tide breaking, which shows a jump in the damage potential. For R4, the echo burden is still kinda high, but the damage increase is probably worth it. At R5 though, the echo burden is much more attainable, so you might as well go for it. Anyway, if you're stuck with Emerald, the building will take a little longer in the echo mines, but it's still definitely doable. As for Unflickering Valor, which is his signature, again, the data is unreleased, so I will just be comparing it to itself and not to other weapons. Here you can use a Fusion 3 cost and still have high ER, so it is good to use ER Fusion 3 cost. So Brant's highest damage potential is actually his signature weapon, Tide Breaking, with ER Fusion 3 cost. And you can really see the damage potential of tide breaking with a character that both demands high ER and then makes use of it. Hence, he's a pretty easy to build ER scaling character, and his signature makes it even easier. Here, it is still better to use a crit rate for cost at R1, because even though he has crit rate in his skill tree, you still cannot break the 70% crit rate with just substats. So because of that, you can use a crit rate for cost at R1, but it's good to have crit rate on Brant anyway, since he does have nuke damage in his forte skill, and I personally would hate it if he doesn't crit. I don't know about you. Maybe you like to gamba. Okay, now just for comparison, you can also see how Camelia's weapon Red Spring and Changli's weapon Blazing Brilliance are for Brant. Both weapons cannot reach the 250 threshold on tide breaking without using the Coke build. For Red Spring, as expected, Molten still performs a bit better. For Blazing, since it is a crit damage weapon, you mostly cannot get enough crit rate without a 4 cost echo, so 33311 is out of the question. But anyway, Molten is the only option for Blazing. Now Red Spring has a basic attack damage passive that is useful for Brant, but Blazing's passive is for resonant skill damage and isn't as helpful. This probably explains this difference in damage potential. Now compared to R1 Emerald on Molten, they are similar and still better than Overture. Finally, for any echo config, at least the substat priorities are still the same. You basically want double crit and ER in the substats of all of your echoes. After that, attack percent and basic attack damage are really useful. He does have liberation and skill damage, so those are also okay, but not as desired as basic. As usual, defense and HP are basically trash. He doesn't really use heavy attack in his mid-air mode, so it's likely you will not be using heavy very much either. Anyway, I hope this video helped you out, and I will be making a full Brant guide on his release, so like and subscribe if you are interested in more WooWa content, and leave any comments on how your Brant pre-farm is going. That's it for today, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye bye!